Good morning. This is Rich Nass, Executive Vice President of Open Systems Media, and we are here for this week's discussion with Ray Zinn, the longtime former CEO of Micrel and doer of lots of other good stuff, which we're going to get into over the next couple of weeks. Hello, Ray. How are you?
We're doing just fine. A long trip, but I'm back in the saddle again.
Good, good. I'm glad to hear it. And that actually might be literally for you because I know you're a horse guy. But, okay, so as we often tackle topics that are not politically correct, I got another one for you. Age. How old is too old? I don't think I want to get into the presidential part of this, even though we have two candidates who are arguably too old to hold the office that they're running for. But let's talk about age in the CEO's office. Should there be a mandatory retirement age for a CEO of a public company, or how do you know when it's? Or very often you don't know that you're too old to have a job like that. Where do you stand on that?
Well, that's an interesting question, and especially because I'm reflecting on my age. I turned 79 this coming Saturday, and so I was 78 when I left Micrel. We sold it to Microchip, and I think one of the reasons that the board had for considering alternatives to the company was because of my age. I served as the CEO of Micrel since its inception in 1978, and I was just about 40 at the time, and then ran it for 37 years, and we sold it. And they thought I was getting maybe a little old. I don't think it was a performance issue. I think it was just they thought that the investors, because the investors tend to be younger people, and these kids that run these investment institutions, they're probably in their late 20s, early 30s, and retire from that and go on to something else when they're in their mid 30s or early 40s. So they look at me and they say, "Wow, that guy's really old." I'm like a grandfather to them. I remember talking to a friend of mine who was in his early 60s recently. Actually, this happened, applying at one of the big companies out here in Silicon Valley. And when they, even though technically they couldn't ask him how old he was, when he came in for the interview, he obviously looked late 50s, early 60s, and they just invited him to leave. So they're only hiring people that are in their 40s. So I don't think it's just being a CEO. I think it's a situation where companies are just looking for younger people.
So what do you think of a mandatory retirement age?
Well, technically we can't have a mandatory retirement age. That's something that's not supposed to be doable under the law. But I know that one of the companies in my industry wanted me to serve on the board until they found out how old I was, and they said, "Well, we have a mandatory retirement age of 70." So obviously I exceeded that by quite a few years, and they couldn't hire me even though I'm perfectly capable of doing it. They just had this mandatory age of 70. The airlines have a mandatory of 60, to be a pilot. So obviously the airlines must think that there's some age that's too old to fly an airplane. So I don't know. I'm probably not the best one to talk about that because I'm getting older myself. Yet I feel great. I mean, I can still do 100 push-ups and I'm pretty healthy.
But I'm confused by that. You told me it's illegal to do that, yet this company said that they did have a mandatory age of 70. How did that work? How did they get around that?
Because these are not employees; these are board members, and so it's not. They're not considered like a consultant. They're not considered an employee. They don't get the health benefits and the other things that employees do. So they're not technically employees. They're just, as you would, board of directors are more like contractors.
So are you insulted by that?
Yeah, I guess I was.
Did you look to fight it?
No, I didn't know. No, I like these guys and didn't want to fight. I mean, that was their rule. They've had it in their bylaws for years, so it's not like it's something they just put in recently. So, and a number of companies do that. I mean, in fact, there's a number of companies that actually have a mandatory retirement age for senior executives. So it's not unusual. I mean, if your contract says, like an airline pilot, that when you hit this magical age that you retire, then you have to retire. And my mother was a school teacher, and she went 5 years beyond the mandatory retirement age for California school teachers. So they do allow that, some exceptions, but at some point they finally told her that she was going to have to retire. So anyway, there is that discrimination, I say, on age, and that's why they have that law.
Okay. Well, in terms of the pilots, I'm fine with that because, like I said in the beginning, usually the person themselves is the last one to know that they should be retiring, and with a pilot, you have other people's lives in your hands, so I'm fine with that. But I don't know, it's a pretty touchy situation. Like I said. Let me just ask you, just one last question. Have you seen situations where somebody really should have retired before because they, didn't have the, full faculties?
Well, I had one individual who worked for me that said he's retired and hasn't told anybody. So some people just retire from working, but they still draw a check. And of course, if you're not producing, you ought to retire. And some people get to the point where they run out of gas. I mean, they don't have to be at any magical age. You can act like you're retired at the age of 45, and so it all depends upon the individual and kind of what their mindset is. So I don't know. I think as long as you are perfectly capable, then you ought to continue. By the way, I was at the football game at Virginia Tech last Saturday, and the guy sitting next to me was a vascular surgeon, and he was in his 70s. So I mean, here's the guy's operating on your jugular vein, and he's in his 70s. So I don't know. I guess I don't know that he had a mandatory retirement requirement for the hospital he worked for, but I guess it just depends on the situation and what the hiring organization is willing to put up with.
Would you want a mandatory retirement age in the hospital that you're going into? I think I would.
Well, this guy was very capable, obviously. I mean, I talked to him at length, and he seemed to be very capable. So I guess, you pull a plug on yourself when you feel that you're not able to continue in that role. He seemed to be perfectly capable. I mean, he didn't act like he was someone. I'm guessing at his age, by the way. I mean, he definitely looked as old as I am. And so I was guessing that he must have been in his early 70s or late 60s anyway. So, but he was still a practicing surgeon. So I guess it just depends upon your area and your occupation and where you feel you need to pull the plug. As I said, I've seen people who are in their late 40s or early 50s that act like they're retired and still working. So anyway, those guys they've lost interest, and at that point, I think they ought to pull the plug.
Yep, I'd agree with that. Okay, let's put a wrap on this week's segment. That was Ray Zinn, our expert business consultant, and lots of other stuff. And I'm Rich Nass with Open Systems Media. Hope you have a great day, Ray.
Thanks a lot, Rich.